She didn't wake up to a fairy tale. She woke up to the stench of wet fur, rotting cabbage, and the aching cold of a dirt floor. She was an omega, the lowest of the low. And she had no idea the scar on her neck was a death sentence or a crown. Dirt was the first thing she tasted. It coated her tongue, gritty and foul, mixed with the metallic tang of her own split lip. Faye opened her eyes to the dim, gray light of the pen. It wasn't a cell, not exactly. It was a lean-to built against the palisade wall of the settlement, roofed with rotting thatch that let the sleet drip directly onto her thin, wool shift. She pushed herself up on hands and knees. Her joints popped, stiff from the freezing damp. Her head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. The fever had broken, leaving behind a hollow, ravenous weakness. She didn't remember the worst of the sickness. She only remembered the burning, the feeling of her bones rearranging themselves, and then the crushing weight of the pack's hierarchy settling over her like a stone slab. When the fever took her, she was a lowly but tolerated villager. When she woke, she was an omega. Her scent had changed. It was sour now, devoid of the sharp pine and musk assertiveness of the hunters. She smelled like prey. She smelled like submission. Outside the lean-to, the heavy squelch of boots in mud signaled the waking of the settlement. Faye shivered, pulling her knees to her chest. She rubbed her arms, her fingers catching on the rough, raised skin at the base of her neck. It was a birthmark, or perhaps a childhood scar, a pale, crescent shape intersected by a jagged line. It burned slightly this morning, a localized heat that contrasted with the freezing air. She ignored it. Scars were the least of her problems. Up. The word was a low grunt, followed by a heavy kick to the wooden slat of her shelter. Rowan stood there. He was a beta, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, wrapped in a cured wolf pelt that smelled overwhelmingly of dried blood and stale sweat. His eyes were flat, a muddy brown that held no malice, only utter indifference. That was worse, Faye thought. Malice meant you were a person to be hated. Indifference meant you were an object. The hunters return at midday, Rowan said, spitting a dark wad of chewing root into the mud near her bare feet. The skinning racks need clearing. The fires need tending. Move, Omega. Faye's throat tightened. The urge to bare her teeth, to tell him to go to hell, flared in her chest. But her body betrayed her. Before her mind could form the words of defiance, her shoulders slumped, her chin dipped, and her eyes averted to the mud. It was a physical compulsion, a sickening, deeply ingrained instinct that flooded her veins with ice water. Her wolf, the pathetic, broken thing inside her, demanded obedience to the stronger scent. She hated herself for it. She hated the way her voice came out as a raspy, compliant whisper. Yes. Rowan turned and walked away. He didn't even wait to see if she obeyed. He knew she would. Faye crawled out of the lean-to, her bare feet sinking into the freezing, ankle-deep muck of the yard. The settlement was a chaotic sprawl of timber longhouses and smoke-blackened hearths. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the overwhelming musky scent of 100 territorial predators living in close quarters. For the next 4 hours, Faye existed in a state of numb, mechanical labor. She dragged wooden buckets of water from the freezing stream, her hands turning purple, the skin cracking around her knuckles. She stood at the skinning racks, stripping the hides off frozen hares and scrawny deer. The slick, wet sound of the membrane tearing away from muscle made her stomach churn. But she forced herself to work. She was starving. Her hands were coated in tacky, drying blood and animal fat. When no one was looking, she carved a tiny sliver of raw, tough venison from a carcass and slipped it under her tongue. She let it sit there, tasting the copper and salt, chewing it so slowly that her jaw ached, terrified that the heavy chewing motion would give her away. She was pathetic. The realization wasn't a profound tragedy. It was just a dull, persistent ache. Around noon, the atmosphere in the settlement shifted. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a change in the barometric pressure. The hairs on Faye's arms stood on end. The constant, low-level bickering of the pack ceased. The women at the washing tubs stopped scrubbing. The blacksmith's hammer rested on the anvil. The heavy wooden gates of the palisade groaned open. Tristan had returned. The alpha of the Blackridge pack rode in on a massive, shaggy warhorse, though the beast looked nervous beneath him. Tristan didn't look like a king. He looked like a warlord carved from weathered stone and violence. His dark hair was matted with sweat and sleet. His face was a map of harsh angles, shadowed by exhaustion. He wore a heavy chainmail hauberk over a padded tunic, the metal links smeared with dried mud and darker, rust-colored stains. Faye stood by the skinning rack, her bloodied hands gripping a skinning knife. The smell of him hit her like a physical blow. It was ozone and crushed pine needles, beneath the heavy, suffocating weight of absolute dominance. Every instinct in Faye's body screamed at her to drop to the ground, to expose her neck. The older Omegas around the yard were already on their knees in the mud. Faye fought it. Her knees trembled. She locked her joints, her fingernails biting into the wooden handle of the knife until her knuckles went white. She stared at the ground, but she refused to kneel. She wouldn't give him that. She didn't even know the man, but she hated him because of what he made her biology do. Tristan dismounted. His boots hit the mud with a heavy thud. He tossed the reins to a waiting beta. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His gaze swept over the yard, taking inventory. And then, he stopped. Faye didn't look up, but she felt his focus. It was like standing too close to a raging bonfire. The heat was oppressive, burning against her skin. He wasn't looking at the hunters, or the spoils of the hunt. He was looking at the skinning racks. He was looking at her. Her breath hitched in her throat. The knife slipped in her greasy hand, slicing a shallow cut across her palm. She gasped, dropping the blade into the mud. The sharp tang of her own fresh blood hit the air. Tristan's head snapped toward the scent. A low, vibrating rumble started in his chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression. It was something deeper, something confused and ancient. Faye finally looked up. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met across the muddy yard. His eyes were a startling, piercing amber. In them, Faye didn't see the stoic, unbreakable alpha. She saw a sudden, violent fracture. Then, he turned sharply on his heel and strode toward the great hall, leaving the yard breathless and silent in his wake. The evening meal was a chaotic, brutal affair. The great hall was a massive structure of rough-hewn oak and smoke-stained rafters. The central fire pit roared, throwing violent orange shadows against the walls. The heat was stifling, thick with the smell of roasting fat, stale ale, and the overwhelming musk of the pack. Faye sat in the darkest corner, as far from the high table as the walls allowed. This was the Omega's place, the dusty, drafty edges where the hounds usually slept. They ate last, and they ate what was left. Tonight, that meant a wooden trencher of lukewarm barley gruel and a pile of stripped marrow bones. She huddled over her bowl, her wet hair clinging to her cheeks. She had washed in the freezing stream before the meal, scrubbing the animal blood from her hands and arms with coarse sand. The cold water had aggravated the scar on her neck. It throbbed a steady, rhythmic pulse that matched her heartbeat. She reached up, her fingers tracing the raised silver crescent beneath the collar of her rough tunic. It felt hot to the touch. "Stop scratching, fleabag," a sharp voice hissed. Faye didn't look up. It was Sybil. Sybil was a beta who had aged out of her prime, her bitter resentment manifesting as cruelty toward anyone beneath her. She sat a few feet away, gnawing on a bone with vicious, snapping bites. "I'm not scratching," Faye muttered, keeping her eyes on her gruel. "You stink of fear and copper," Sybil sneered, leaning closer. "You bled in the yard today. The alpha smelled you. Pathetic little bleeder." Trying to get his attention, Faye's grip tightened on her wooden spoon. "I dropped a knife. It was an accident." "An accident," Sybil mocked. She suddenly reached out, her thick fingers snatching the largest, meat-flecked bone from the pile in front of Faye. Accidents happen to clumsy Omegas. Sometimes they lose their supper. Faye's stomach let out a hollow, painful cramp. That bone had a scrap of fat on it. She needed that fat to survive the night's cold. Logic told her to let it go. Submission was safety. But the agonizing hunger, combined with the lingering, humiliating fury from the morning, snapped something inside her. She didn't act like a hero. She acted like a starving, desperate animal. Faye lunged. She slammed her shoulder into Sybil's chest, her unwashed hand clawing at the bone. Sybil let out a squawk of surprise that quickly turned into a feral snarl. The older woman dropped the bone and backhanded Faye across the face. The blow was heavy, catching Faye on the cheekbone. Her head snapped back, her skull cracking hard against the timber wall. White light exploded behind her eyes. Before Faye could recover, Sybil was on her, a knee pressing hard into Faye's stomach, driving the air from her lungs. Sybil's hand gripped the collar of Faye's woolen shift, twisting it tight against her windpipe. "You dare?" Sybil spat, spittle hitting Faye's cheek. "You challenge me, you piece of dirt?" Faye couldn't breathe. The rough wool sawed into her neck. She clawed frantically at Sybil's wrist, her nails digging into the skin. But the beta was far too strong. The hall around them, previously deafening, suddenly dropped in volume. The scuffle had drawn attention. Enough. The word wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It cut through the heavy air of the hall like a broadsword. Sybil froze. The oppressive pine and ozone scent of the alpha suddenly swallowed all the oxygen in the corner. Sybil released Faye's collar and scrambled backward, dropping immediately to her hands and knees in the dust, exposing her neck. Faye collapsed onto her side, gasping violently for air. Her lungs burned. She curled into a fetal position, coughing, her hands instinctively flying to her bruised throat. In the scuffle, the neckline of her cheap shift had been torn. The fabric ripped violently sideways, slipping off her shoulder. Heavy boots stepped into her line of sight. They were coated in dried mud and ash. Tristan stood over her. The silence in the great hall was absolute. Not a single bench scraped. Not a single cup was set down. Faye squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the punishment. Fighting over scraps was a disruption of pack order. The alpha punished disruptions. Instead of a boot to the ribs, she felt a sudden shocking heat. Tristan dropped to one knee. His large, calloused hand reached out. He didn't grab her throat. His fingers brushed against her bare shoulder, pushing the torn fabric of her shift aside completely. His touch was rough, hesitant, and trembling. Faye's eyes flew open. Tristan was staring at her neck, at the scar, the pale crescent intersected by the jagged line. The alpha's face had drained of color. The harsh, warlord mask was gone, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. His amber eyes were wide, the pupils dilated so far they almost swallowed the iris. He wasn't breathing. "Where?" Tristan's voice was a ragged rasp, as if the word had to tear its way out of his throat. "Where did you get this?" Faye shrank back against the wall, terrified. The heat radiating from him was suffocating. I was born with it. Or a fever. I don't know." Her voice shook uncontrollably. Tristan didn't look at her face. He just stared at the mark, his hand hovering mere inches from her skin, radiating a desperate heat. The scent in the air changed. The heavy dominance fractured, replaced by something wild, agonized, and profoundly vulnerable. It smelled like rain on dry earth, like grief. He didn't pull her into his arms. He didn't declare her his mate in a booming, romantic proclamation. He looked at her, as if she were a ghost, holding a knife to his chest. "Leave us," Tristan ordered. His voice was soft, but it carried to the rafters. Nobody moved. The shock was too great. I said, "Get out." The roar was deafening, a visceral explosion of power that shook the dust from the ceiling. The great hall emptied in a chaotic scramble of bodies and overturned benches. Within seconds, only the crackle of the fire remained. Tristan slowly lowered his hand, finally meeting Faye's terrified gaze. His chest heaved. He looked entirely undone. "You," he whispered, the word laced with a terrible, bitter disbelief. "It's you." The silence in the great hall was so absolute it rang in Faye's ears, a high, thin whine like a trapped mosquito. The only movement was the lazy swirl of ash rising from the central fire pit, caught in the draft of the poorly sealed roof. Faye pressed her spine against the rough, splintered timber of the wall. She wanted to meld into it, to disappear into the grain of the wood. Tristan knelt before her, a mountain of mud-spattered mail and leather, breathing like a man who had just run 10 miles in deep snow. His amber eyes were locked onto her exposed collarbone. He looked terrified. It was a deeply wrong expression for a warlord to wear. It made Faye's stomach clench with a new, colder dread. "Who are you?" he demanded. The rumble in his chest vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up Faye's bare legs. "Faye," she choked out. Her voice was a pathetic squeak. The bruising on her throat from Sybil's hands was already beginning to throb, tight and hot. "I'm just Faye. I work the skinning racks." Tristan shook his head, a jerky, mechanical motion. "No, that's not what I asked. Before the camp. Before this." His heavy hand gestured vaguely to the filthy hem of her shift, to the mud caked between her toes. "Where did you come from?" "The lower valley," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the heavy wooden doors, calculating the distance. It was too far. He would catch her before she made 3 steps. "The sickness wiped out my village 3 winters ago. The pack took in the stragglers. I've been here. I've always been here." He wasn't listening. His gaze remained fixed on the crescent scar. Slowly, as if reaching into a fire, he extended his hand again. He didn't ask permission. An alpha never did. His fingertips brushed the raised skin of her neck. Faye flinched violently, expecting a blow, a burn, something to punish her for existing. Instead, the contact sent a violent, electric shock through her nervous system. It wasn't a spark of romance. It was the sickening lurch of a bone snapping back into its socket. The air in her lungs vanished. A wave of heat radiated from the point of contact, sinking through her skin, diving straight into her marrow. Her vision went stark white at the edges. Tristan let out a raw, guttural sound, pulling his hand back as if he had been burned. He stumbled upright, his boots scraping harshly against the packed dirt floor. He clutched his own chest, directly over his heart, his face contorting in an agony so profound it made Faye's breath catch. "It can't be," he gasped, his chest heaving. The heavy scent of pine and ozone spiked, turning bitter, sharp with panic. He paced 3 steps away, then pivoted back, his eyes wild. "She died. I felt the bond sever. I felt her die." Faye pulled her knees to her chest, tugging the torn fabric of her shift back over her shoulder with trembling, bloody fingers. She had no idea what he was talking about, and she didn't care. She just wanted to be back in the freezing mud of her lean-to. The cold made sense. Starvation made sense. This suffocating, invisible tether wrapping tightly around her ribs did not. "I don't know what you want from me," she pleaded, her voice cracking. Tears of pure exhaustion pricked her eyes, mixing with the grime on her cheeks. "Please, let me go back outside. I won't eat the bone. I won't fight. Just let me go." Tristan stopped pacing. He stared down at her, seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time. He took in her hollow cheeks, the dark bruised circles under her eyes, the pathetic thinness of her wrists. Disgust flashed across his face. Not disgust for her, Faye realized with a jarring shock, but disgust for himself, for the state of her. "You smell of rot and fear," he said, the words blunt and cruel in their honesty. "I am an Omega," she shot back, a sudden, inexplicable spike of adrenaline cutting through her terror. "I eat garbage. I sleep in the mud. What did you expect me to smell like? Roses? The defiance hung in the air, dangerous and sharp. A beta would have been gutted for speaking to the alpha that way. Faye braced herself for the backhand, squeezing her eyes shut. It never came. Instead, a heavy, fur-lined cloak fell over her shoulders, swallowing her in warmth and the overwhelming scent of Tristan. It was too heavy. It pressed her down into the dirt. "Stand up," he ordered. The vulnerability was gone from his voice, replaced by the flat, crushing tone of command. Faye tried. She pushed against the floor, her legs shaking uncontrollably. But the adrenaline crash hit her all at once. The starvation, the blow to the head from Sybil, the bizarre, agonizing energy of the mate bond, it was too much. Her knees buckled. Before she could hit the floor, Tristan caught her. His hands gripped her waist, massive and uncompromising. He didn't scoop her up gently, like a fragile maiden. He hoisted her over his shoulder like a sack of grain. The movement forced the air from her lungs. Faye panicked. She beat her fists against the chainmail covering his back, scraping her knuckles on the iron rings. "Put me down," she wheezed, thrashing her legs. "Don't touch me." He ignored her entirely. He strode toward the heavy timber stairs that led to the upper level of the great hall, his grip on the back of her thighs unyielding. The sheer physical disparity between them was terrifying. She was a leaf caught in a hurricane. "Stop fighting, you foolish creature," he grunted, taking the stairs two at a time. "You're going to break your own hands." Faye stopped hitting him. Not because he told her to, but because the world was beginning to spin violently. The smell of the smoke, the metallic tang of his armor, and the deep, throbbing heat of the scar on her neck blended into a nauseating wave. Her head slumped against his broad back. As the darkness pulled her under, her last conscious thought was a bitter prayer that she wouldn't wake up at all. The heat woke her first. It wasn't the searing, chaotic heat of the central fire pit, but a dense, suffocating warmth that settled deep into her bones. Faye opened her eyes. The ceiling above her wasn't rotting thatch. It was tightly joined timber, polished, smooth, and free of soot. She bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sudden movement made her head swim, bile rising sharply in her throat. She clamped a hand over her mouth, swallowing hard until the nausea subsided. She was in a bed, a real bed, raised off the floor on heavy wooden legs, piled high with thick, gray wolf pelts and woolen blankets. The mattress underneath was stuffed with feathers, completely alien to a body accustomed to packed dirt and frozen roots. Faye threw the pelts off, her bare legs swinging over the side. Her torn shift had been removed. She was wearing an oversized tunic of fine, bleached linen that fell to her mid-thigh. It smelled intensely of Tristan. The scent made her wolf, the broken, submissive thing inside her, whimper with a pathetic, terrifying comfort. She hated it. She grabbed the edge of the mattress, her knuckles turning white. The room was large, Spartan, but undeniably wealthy. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, the embers glowing a sullen red. A heavy oak table stood in the corner, scattered with maps and crude iron daggers. The single window was shuttered against the storm outside, but the wind howled through the cracks, a stark reminder of the frozen hell she had escaped, or the new hell she had entered. The heavy wooden door groaned on its iron hinges. Faye scrambled backward across the bed, pressing herself against the headboard, pulling the furs up to her chin. Tristan stepped into the room. He had removed his armor. He wore simple dark trousers and a loose tunic, his feet bare. Without the imposing bulk of chainmail, he looked leaner, but no less dangerous. The predatory grace in his movements was more pronounced. He carried a wooden tray. He didn't look at her. He walked to the small table by the hearth, set the tray down, and stood with his back to her, staring into the fire. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. "Eat," he commanded, his voice rough. Faye didn't move. Her eyes darted from his broad back to the tray. The smell hit her then. Roasted venison, dripping with fat. Warm, dark bread. A bowl of clear, steaming broth. Her stomach gave a violent, painful cramp. betraying her pride with a loud gurgle. "I said eat," Tristan repeated, turning slightly to look over his shoulder. His amber eyes were guarded, the pupils contracted into sharp points. "Unless you prefer the garbage in the yard." The insult stung, snapping Faye out of her paralysis. She threw the furs aside and marched to the table on shaking legs. She didn't sit. She grabbed a piece of the venison with her bare hands, tearing into it with her teeth. The rich, salty grease coated her tongue. It was the best thing she had tasted in a year. She swallowed it almost whole, reaching for the bread. Slowly, Tristan warned, taking a step toward her. "Your stomach shrank. You'll throw it up." She ignored him, stuffing the bread into her mouth, her eyes fixed on him like a feral dog defending a bone. She expected him to stop her, to exert his dominance, but he just watched, his jaw tight, a muscle ticking in his cheek. Within 2 minutes, the pain hit. It felt like a hot knife, twisting directly beneath her ribs. Faye doubled over, dropping the remaining bread onto the floor. She gasped, clutching her stomach, her knees hitting the polished wood floor with a heavy thud. Tristan was there in an instant. He knelt beside her, his large hand coming to rest firmly against the center of her back. The heat of his palm seeped through the linen tunic. "I told you," he murmured. There was no anger in his tone, only a heavy, exhausted resignation. Faye retched dryly, her forehead pressing against the cold iron grate of the hearth. "Don't touch me," she rasped, trying to jerk away from his hand, but she had no strength. "I have to," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate gravel. "The pack is awake. They can smell you up here. They can smell my scent on you. If I don't touch you, if they don't sense the bond settling, they will tear you apart the moment you step outside this room." Faye froze. She turned her head, looking at him. He was terrifyingly close. She could see the faint silver scars cutting through his eyebrow, the shadow of exhaustion beneath his eyes. "An Omega in the Alpha's bed," she whispered, the reality of pack politics crashing down on her. "Sybil. The others. They'll kill me." "Sybil has been dealt with," Tristan stated flatly. The cold finality in his eyes made Faye shudder. "But the rest of them, yes, they will try. Aluna must be strong. She must command respect. You command pity." The words felt like a slap. Faye pushed herself upright, putting a foot of space between them. "I didn't ask to be your Luna. I didn't ask for this mark." Her hand flew to her neck, covering the scar. "You said your mate died. Let her be dead. Send me back to the yard." Tristan's lips thinned into a hard line. He reached out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. He didn't squeeze, but the grip was immovable. He pulled her hand away from her neck. "I watched my mate's carriage go over a cliff into the ravine 7 years ago," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion, a dead, flat recitation of a nightmare. "I searched the river for weeks. I found blood. I found her torn cloak. The bond inside my head snapped. It went completely silent. I have lived with a corpse in my chest for 7 years." He leaned closer, his amber eyes burning into hers. The scent of ozone grew sharp, almost metallic. "And then yesterday, a starving, filthy Omega drops a knife in the mud, and my chest rips open again. The mark on your neck is the exact mirror of the one I put on her before she died." He released her wrist, running a hand roughly through his dark hair. "I don't know if you're a trick of the gods, a witch, or a ghost, but the bond recognizes you, which means, by pack law and by my own blood, you belong to me." "I am not a thing to be claimed," Faye spat, her voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of fury and despair. Tristan stood up, towering over her. He looked down at her small, trembling form on the floorboards. "You are now," he said quietly. "Rest, Faye, because tomorrow you have to prove to 300 wolves that you deserve to live." Morning bled into the room like a bruise, painting the timber walls in shades of sickly purple and gray. Faye sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at her bare, filthy feet resting against the polished floorboards. Beside her lay a dress of heavy, tightly woven wool, dyed a dark, rusted crimson. Tristan had left it there before dawn. It smelled of cedar chips and dry dust, clearly pulled from a deep chest that hadn't been opened in years. She pulled it over her head. The fabric was stiff, meant for a woman with meat on her bones, not a starved husk. It hung off her sharp shoulders, pooling awkwardly at her ankles. She looked ridiculous. A beggar hiding inside a stolen banner. The heavy door swung open. Tristan stood in the frame, dressed in dark leather and a thick wolf pelt mantle. His amber eyes swept over her. He didn't offer a compliment or an encouraging smile. He just stared at the way the crimson collar framed the silver, jagged scar on her neck. A muscle in his jaw twitched rapidly. "It is time," he said. His voice was a flat, emotionless drone, but the air around him smelled of burning ozone. He was tightly coiled, bracing for a massacre. Faye didn't speak. She wrapped her thin arms around her ribs and followed him out into the drafty corridor. The descent down the timber stairs was agonizing. Her joints popped in the freezing air. The great hall was empty, the fire reduced to white ash, but the massive oak doors leading to the courtyard were thrown wide open. Beyond them lay the frozen mud and the pack. The moment Faye crossed the threshold into the pale winter sunlight, the low murmur of the settlement ceased. 300 wolves stood in the yard. The sheer physical presence of them formed a suffocating wall. They smelled of damp fur, rancid breath, and acute, aggressive suspicion. They didn't see a Luna. They saw the Omega, who had been skinning their rabbits yesterday. Tristan walked out beside her, not in front of her. It was a subtle shift in positioning, but the pack understood the visual language perfectly. He was presenting her. A collective rumble started at the back of the crowd, vibrating through the frozen ground and up through Faye's bare feet. It wasn't a cheer. It was the sound of a predator realizing its prey was wandering outside the cage. A man stepped forward from the front ranks. It was Bram. He was the lead tracker, a massive brute of a beta with a face ruined by bear claws and eyes like chips of black flint. He wore no shirt despite the sleet, his thick, scarred torso covered in swirling blue woad tattoos. Bram didn't look at Faye. He aimed his dead stare directly at the alpha. "You insult us, Tristan," Bram rumbled, his voice thick with phlegm. "A fever dream is one thing, but bringing a scavenger to the high table? She reeks of fear and dirty water. She is Omega. She belongs in the dirt." Tristan didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. "She carries the mark. The bond claims her." "The bond is a lie bred from your own grief," Bram roared, spitting a glob of saliva onto the frost-hardened mud. "You lost your mind in the river 7 years ago. We have bled for you, Alpha. We have starved for you. We will not bow to a rat just because you see a ghost on her neck." The yard erupted in a chorus of snarls. The pressure in the air spiked dangerously, threatening to crush the breath out of Faye's lungs. Bram turned his black eyes to Faye. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply took a step toward her and unleashed his scent. It was a physical assault. A wave of pure, unfiltered dominance hit Faye like a falling oak tree. Her biology betrayed her instantly. The broken wolf inside her whimpered, clawing at the inside of her skull, screaming for her to drop. Her vision narrowed to a pinprick. Gravity multiplied. Her knees buckled, and she hit the freezing, jagged mud with a sickening thud. Laughter rippled through the pack. It was a cruel, scraping sound. "See?" Bram sneered, standing over her, his shadow swallowing her completely. "A rat." Faye knelt in the mud. The freezing water seeped through the crimson wool, stinging her bruised skin. Her lungs burned. This was it. This was where she died. If she stayed down, Tristan would lose his command, and they would both be torn apart. If she stood, Bram would rip her throat out. But the scar on her neck began to burn. It wasn't a magical infusion of strength. It was pure, distilled agony. radiating from the mark down into her marrow. And with it came an emotion that wasn't hers, a phantom flash of absolute, towering fury. It was the echo of the woman who had died, mixing violently with Faye's own deep, exhaustion-fueled resentment. She was so tired of being cold. She was so tired of being hungry. Faye dug her raw, cracking fingers into the mud. She didn't snarl. She didn't let out a heroic battle cry. She simply pushed. Her arms shook violently. Her joints screamed in protest. She forced one foot under her, dragging the heavy, wet wool of her dress up from the muck. It took everything she had. Her breath came in ragged, wheezing gasps, a thin line of blood trickling from her split lip. She stood up. She was tiny. She was starving. The wind threatened to blow her over, but she locked her trembling knees and tilted her chin up. She looked Bram directly in the eye. Bram paused. His lips curled back over yellowed canines. He leaned in close, his rotting breath washing over her face. "I will snap your neck, little bird." "Do it," Faye whispered. Her voice was raspy, broken, but entirely steady. She stared into his black eyes with absolute, hollow apathy. "Break it." "But I am never kneeling in this mud again." Bram hesitated. Wolves understood fear. They understood challenge. They did not understand prey that looked at a predator with utter indifference. Her lack of terror short-circuited his violent instincts. In that fraction of a second, the air pressure in the yard imploded. Tristan didn't move, but his aura detonated. The smell of crushed pine and searing ozone smothered the yard, a suffocating, violent blanket of absolute authority. He didn't touch Faye, but he stood directly behind her, his chest mere inches from her back. Bram choked. The Alpha's power forced the air straight out of his lungs. The large Beta's eyes darted from Faye's dead, unwavering stare to the towering shadow of his Alpha behind her. Slowly, grinding his teeth in bitter humiliation, Bram broke eye contact. He lowered his massive head, took a step backward, and bared his throat to the sleet. The submission rippled outward. One by one, the hunters, the Betas, and the remaining Omegas dropped to their knees in the mud, exposing their necks to the pale sun. Faye stood amidst the sea of kneeling wolves, shivering so hard her teeth clicked together. She wasn't victorious. She was marked. She was a target. And as Tristan's heavy, trembling hand finally came to rest on her shoulder, she knew this wasn't a fairy tale. It was a war. Thank you for tuning in to the epic conclusion of Faye and Tristan's dark journey. If this gritty medieval werewolf romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and share this video with your fellow fantasy lovers. What do you think awaits Faye as the new Luna of the Blackridge pack? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss our next immersive audio drama.